A Navy SEAL reached an FBI agent's cabin in the cold Minnesota rain, barely standing, clutching a sealed drive no one was supposed to find. Her German Shepherd K9 froze before the door opened. On his coat was the scent of an old missing dog named Valor. One whispered name led to a wooden box, a stolen code, and a company hiding behind kindness. If you believe God still guides the forgotten home, leave amen. The rain came softly at first, then harder, as if the sky over northern Minnesota had remembered something sorrowful and could not keep it to itself. Claire Whitmore drove home through the wet pine roads outside Duluth with both hands steady on the wheel and the headlights cutting pale tunnels through the mist. She was 30 years old, an FBI agent with clear gray eyes, chestnut hair usually tied low at the nape of her neck, and the kind of quiet face people trusted before they knew why. Her build was athletic, not showy, shaped by early mornings, long cases, and a stubborn refusal to let fear make her careless. People at the field office called her calm. That was not entirely true. Claire simply believed panic was a luxury best saved for after the work was done. Her cabin sat beyond a narrow gravel road where the trees opened toward Lake Superior. It was a small place with cedar walls, a sloped roof, and a back porch that faced the dark line of water beyond the pines. In daylight, the lake looked endless and silver. At night, it seemed older than memory. Claire stepped inside, shook rain from her jacket, and let the warmth of the kitchen gather around her. A lamp glowed over the wooden table. A kettle waited on the stove. The world outside murmured against the windows, cold and restless, while the cabin held its little circle of light like a lantern in a storm. Atlas lay near the back door. He was a 4-year-old German Shepherd, sable-coated and broad-chested, with black shading across his back and amber eyes that seemed to measure not only movement, but intention. His ears were tall and sharp, his muzzle long and dark, and his temperament was unusually restrained for a dog trained to move fast when danger asked for it. Atlas did not waste sound. He rarely barked unless something in the world had crossed a line that only he could see. That night, he watched Claire remove her boots, watched her place the North Star Civic Systems file on the table, and then lowered his head again. Almost. Claire poured tea and opened the file. North Star looked beautiful on paper, a civic technology company, a veteran support program, a retired K9 care initiative called Safe Paws, a security platform named Sentinel Harbor supposedly built to help lake towns, ports, and small northern communities stay safe. The brochures showed smiling veterans, old dogs in warm blankets, and families standing beneath clean blue skies. But numbers had their own scent, and Claire had spent all day following the faint, sour trail of contracts that didn't quite match. Software licenses stretched beyond their wording, and data reports that looked too polished for a charity project. Atlas lifted his head. Claire did not move at first. She knew the difference between curiosity and warning in him. Curiosity was a turn of the ear. Warning was stillness. Atlas had gone completely still, his body aligned toward the front of the cabin, his eyes fixed past the hallway and the closed door. Rain tapped the glass. The kettle gave a small, tired hiss. Claire listened. Nothing. Then Atlas stood, not quickly, but with purpose. His paws made no sound on the wooden floor. "Atlas," Claire whispered. The dog did not look back. A branch snapped outside, sharp as a bone breaking in the dark, and then everything paused, the rain, the kettle, even Claire's breathing, until 3 weak knocks touched the front door like a hand asking permission to fall. Claire's training moved before her fear did. She took her sidearm from the locked drawer near the hall, kept it low, and approached the door with Atlas half a step ahead of her. He did not lunge. He did not growl. He lowered his nose to the gap beneath the door and inhaled once, deeply. Then he made a sound Claire had heard only twice before in 4 years, a low, uncertain rumble, not aggression, but recognition mixed with concern. "Who's there?" Claire called. For a moment, the rain answered alone. Then a man's voice came through the wood, thin and broken by cold. "Claire? Whitmore?" Her grip tightened. "Identify yourself." "Evan Rourke." A breath uneven. "Owen Bell said if I made it this far, come to you." Claire opened the door. The man on her porch was tall, though exhaustion had bent him toward the threshold. He looked about 36, with dark hair plastered to his forehead, a hard-boned face roughened by weather and sleeplessness, and short stubble along a jaw clenched against pain. His coat was soaked through, one sleeve was torn, his lips trembled from the cold, and his right hand was wrapped around a small plastic bag as if it were the last warm thing left in the world. Even weakened, he carried himself like someone trained to endure more than he should have to. Navy, Claire thought before he said it. Maybe special operations. The posture did not leave men easily. Atlas stepped forward and sniffed the air around Evan's coat. Rainwater, leather oil, cold metal, industrial cleanser, old K9 strap. Beneath all of it, something else. Dog scent, aged and familiar, clinging faintly to the torn fabric. Evan tried to speak again, but his knees folded. Claire caught his shoulder before he struck the floor, guiding him inside as Atlas pressed close to his other side. The man was heavy, shivering, and nearly spent. Claire dragged him onto the entry rug, shut the door against the storm, and reached for towels from the bench. "Stay with me, Mr. Rourke." "Don't call local," he whispered. Claire looked at him sharply. "A deputy. In their security logs." His eyes struggled to focus on her. They were blue but dulled by fatigue, with the haunted steadiness of a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. North Star watches normal channels. Claire did not argue with a half-conscious man, but she did not ignore procedure either. She opened a secure FBI line from her work phone, sent a coded emergency notice to her supervisor, and requested a restricted medical response from a paramedic she had used once before during a protected witness transport. No open radio chatter, no local dispatch details. Not yet. Evan's fingers would not release the plastic bag. Claire gently worked it free and saw a USB drive inside, wrapped with a folded note gone soft from rain. "Where did you get this?" "Owen?" Evan breathed, before he was gone. Claire placed the drive in an evidence sleeve from her field kit. Atlas nosed Evan's sleeve again, then moved to the inner pocket of the wet coat. Claire reached carefully inside and found a small scrap of paper. The ink had blurred, but the writing was still readable. Mara Bell, Bell's Clock Repair, Harbor Larch. At the name, Evan stirred. "Mara has the box." "What box?" He did not answer. His hand rose weakly from the blanket Claire had placed over him. Two fingers lifted near his chest in a small, precise motion. It was not a signal Claire had taught Atlas. It was not one of theirs. But Atlas froze, ears forward, eyes locked on Evan's hand. Claire felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. The dog was not obeying the signal. He was reacting to the shape of it, to the scent on Evan's sleeve, to the invisible thread of another K9's life braided into this moment. Evan's eyes opened for only a few seconds. He looked past Claire and straight at Atlas. "Valor," he whispered. "If Valor is still alive, he remembers the man who carried the drive." Then his eyes closed again. Outside, the rain thickened over the pines. Atlas turned his head toward the door, silent and rigid, as though some distant fate had just stepped out from the trees and was waiting beyond the porch light. Claire looked from the USB to the wet note in her hand, then to the former Navy SEAL fading in and out of consciousness on her floor. She understood then that Evan Rourke had not only come to her cabin to be saved. He had brought the first doorway into a case North Star had buried beneath charity, software, and carefully polished lies. Morning came to Duluth with the kind of quiet that only follows a long rain. The world outside Claire Whitmore's cabin looked rinsed clean, the pine needles shining dark green, the gravel road silver with puddles, and Lake Superior resting beyond the trees beneath a pale veil of mist. The storm had moved east before dawn, leaving the air cold enough to sharpen every breath. Inside the cabin, the warmth felt smaller now, not because the fire had faded, but because the night had left something behind. Evan Rourke was no longer on Claire's floor. Before sunrise, a restricted medical team had arrived through the FBI's secure request channel. The paramedic in charge was Denise Calder, a compact woman in her late 40s with copper-brown skin, close-cropped black hair, and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who had patched up frightened people in places where sirens were not welcome. Denise asked few questions. Her eyes, kind but practical, took in Evan's soaked coat, the sealed evidence sleeve on Claire's table, and Atlas sitting like a silent guard beside the hall. "He needs warmth, rest, and someone watching the door," Denise said. "He'll have all three," Claire answered. Evan was moved to a protected location under quiet FBI supervision. He had drifted in and out of awareness, asking twice for Valor and once for Maribel. Each time, Atlas had lifted his head. The dog did not understand names the way people did, but he understood patterns. Evan's voice changed whenever he spoke those two names, softer around Valor, more urgent around Mara. Claire noticed both. By 7:30, Claire had briefed her supervisor through the secure line. Assistant Special Agent in charge. Raymond Holt was a broad, heavy-shouldered man in his early 50s with a neatly trimmed salt-and-pepper beard, a tired forehead, and a voice that had learned not to waste words. He had spent years in financial fraud before transferring to public corruption cases, and he carried a permanent skepticism toward anything that arrived wrapped in charity brochures. Claire told him about Evan, the USB, the note, the warning about a deputy, and the name Maribel. Holt listened without interrupting. "Do not open the drive yourself," he said. "Bag it, log it, send it to Tech. You can verify Maribel, quietly." "That was my plan." "I know," Holt replied. "That is why I approved it." Harbor Larch sat 40 minutes north along a road that curved through wet woods, open fields, and small rises where the lake flashed between the trees. Atlas rode in the back of Claire's vehicle, harness on, amber eyes fixed forward. He was calm, but not relaxed. His nose worked each time the air shifted through the vents. Claire understood that look. Atlas was already building a map of the day, 1 cent at a time. The town appeared slowly, as if it had grown from the shore instead of being built there. A white church stood near the center, its steeple bright against the pale sky. An old bakery sent warm cinnamon into the cold air. A woodworking shop displayed hand-carved chairs behind wide glass. Beyond the main street, fishing boats rocked gently at a small dock, their ropes creaking like old knees. Harbor Larch was the kind of town where strangers were noticed, not rudely, but completely. Bell's Clock Repair occupied a narrow brick storefront between the bakery and a closed photography studio. The sign above the door was hand-painted, faded blue, with gold lettering. A little brass bell rang when Claire entered, and the first thing she heard was time. Dozens of clocks ticked from every wall. Mantel clocks, wall clocks, pocket watches beneath glass, grandfather clocks standing like solemn elders in the corners. Behind the counter stood Maribel. She was 62, tall and thin in the way winter trees were thin, not fragile, but stripped down to what could endure. Her silver hair was twisted into a low bun, and her face was narrow, with fair skin marked by soft lines around the mouth and deeper ones beside eyes the color of faded denim. She wore a brown cardigan over a pale blue blouse, and there was a small burn mark on one sleeve, the kind a person forgot after too many years working beside lamps and soldering tools. Her expression hardened the moment she saw Claire's badge. "I already told North Star I am not selling anything," Mara said. Claire lowered the badge slowly. "I'm not with North Star. My name is Claire Whitmore, FBI." Mara's fingers tightened around the cloth she had been using to polish a watch face. "That name was in my son's handwriting." Claire felt the room change. Atlas did too. His ears shifted forward, but he stayed beside her left leg. "Owen Bell?" Claire asked. At the sound of her son's name, Mara's guarded face did not soften. It grew heavier. Owen was 34, tall, too thin because he forgot meals when he worked. Brown hair always falling into his eyes. He had a smile that made people forgive him before he apologized. North Star called him brilliant when they hired him. After he passed away, they called him troubled. That told me more about them than any condolence card. Claire let the silence stand. Some grief did not want comfort. It wanted respect. "Mara, Evan Rourke came to me last night." The cloth slipped from Mara's hand. One clock in the back of the shop struck 8 with a single deep chime, and Atlas turned so suddenly that his harness brushed Claire's knee. In the pause that followed, every smaller clock seemed to hold its breath, as if the whole room had been waiting for Evan's name. Mara walked to the front door, turned the lock, and flipped the sign to closed. "Owen said if Evan came, or if a woman named Claire Whitmore came, I should stop being afraid for 5 minutes. A faint, humorless smile touched her mouth. He knew 5 minutes was about all I could promise. She led Claire behind the counter to a tall walnut cabinet. Atlas moved with them, nose low, careful not to disturb the crowded shelves. Mara took a key from a chain around her neck and opened the cabinet. Inside, beneath folded repair cloths and old brass clock hands, rested a small wooden box. It was plain, cedar maybe, darkened with age. Mara held it for a moment before setting it on the counter, her hands lingering on the lid the way a mother might touch a sleeping child's blanket. "Owen left this 2 weeks before the Mountain Road incident," she said. "He told me not to open the drive. I could not have, even if I wanted to. Password locked. Encrypted, I think. Owen always loved hiding things too well." Claire put on gloves before opening the box. Inside was an old USB drive, a tarnished collar tag engraved with the name Valor, a folded note in Owen's handwriting, and a small strip of worn leather. Atlas leaned closer to the leather and inhaled. His body stilled. "What is it?" Mara whispered. Claire did not answer too quickly. Atlas's reaction mattered, but it was not evidence by itself. "He smelled something like this last night, on Evan's coat." Mara looked toward the collar tag. Valor was Evan's dog, not officially, maybe not on every piece of paper, but anyone with eyes could see it. That old shepherd followed him like he had tied his soul to the man's shadow. Claire unfolded Owen's note. The handwriting was hurried but clear. "If Evan or Claire comes, give them everything. Cedarline was never supposed to be used this way." Valor saw the hand that carried the drive. Claire placed the USB into an evidence sleeve, sealed it, labeled it, and photographed the contents of the box before moving anything else. "This goes to an FBI tech analyst. I won't open it here." "That sounds like Owen would approve," Mara said. Then her face tightened again. "A man from North Star came last week. Expensive coat, polite voice, empty eyes. He offered more money for that box than this shop earns in a winter." "Did he give a name?" "No, only a card." Mara pulled a white business card from beneath the register. Claire did not touch it until she had another sleeve ready. Atlas sniffed the edge of the counter where the card had been. His lips tightened slightly, not a snarl, only the smallest sign of recognition. Industrial cleanser, similar to Evan's coat, similar to something that did not belong in a clock shop. Claire asked about Valor. Mara told her Owen had once described him as a German shepherd with a gray muzzle, brown eyes, and a tired patience that made grown men speak gently. Valor had appeared in North Star events after Evan left, standing beside banners for Safe Paws as if his loyalty could bless every contract in the room. When Claire stepped back onto the sidewalk, The little town looked almost too peaceful. The bakery windows glowed. A gull crossed the pale sky. Then Atlas stopped. Across the street, a black SUV eased away from the curb. No hurry, no squeal of tires, just a smooth departure by someone who had waited long enough to know she was leaving. Claire's phone buzzed before the SUV reached the corner. It was the tech analyst from Duluth, a young woman named Priya Nandakumar, whose sharp mind and soft voice had made more than one nervous agent underestimate her. "The drive from last night is not empty," Priya said. "Most of it is locked down, but one folder title came through." Claire kept her eyes on the fading SUV. "Read it." Cedarland_license. Do not let them erase this. Atlas remained facing the street long after the vehicle disappeared. Claire looked down at the sealed wooden box in her bag, then at the dog who had already found the same scent twice. What had begun with a weakened man at her door had become something colder and larger. Not just a warning, not just a lost K-9 named Valor. A trail of software, contracts, and polished lies was beginning to show beneath the rain-washed morning. By noon, the FBI field office in Duluth felt less like an office and more like a ship turning quietly toward a storm. Outside the windows, the city shone under a clean northern sky, all wet pavement, pale light, and gulls circling over the harbor. Inside, Claire Whitmore stood before a glass board where the first pieces of the North Star case had begun to gather. Evan Rourke's sealed USB, Owen Bell's wooden box, Mara Bell's note, a business card with chemical residue, the name Cedarline Analytics, and one old German shepherd named Valor, who had not yet appeared in person but already seemed to be standing at the center of the room like a forgotten guardian. Assistant Special Agent in Charge Raymond Holt had approved a small, quiet task group. Holt sat at the end of the conference table, with his sleeves rolled once at the wrist, his salt and pepper beard trimmed with military neatness, his broad face unreadable in the way of men who had seen too many pretty lies arrive wearing polished shoes. Beside him was Special Agent Daniel Keene, a lean man in his early 40s with sandy hair, a narrow nose, and the careful eyes of someone who read warrants the way other people read weather. Keene had a dry manner and an old scar across one knuckle from his years working rural corruption cases, where friendly smiles often hid sharper things. Priya Nandakumar occupied the far side of the table with 2 laptops, a stack of evidence logs, and a mug of tea already gone cold. She was 29, small-framed, with warm brown skin, black hair clipped at her jaw, and a calm voice that made complicated systems sound almost gentle. Claire trusted that voice. Atlas trusted the room only after circling it once and lying beneath the board where the evidence photographs hung. Evan Rourke joined them through a secure video connection from the protected medical site. He looked better than he had on Claire's floor, though not well. His face was still pale, the angles of his cheekbones sharper beneath the dark stubble, and his blue eyes carried the exhausted watchfulness of a man still listening for footsteps outside every door. A blanket rested around his shoulders. When he spoke, his voice was rough but steady. "North Star hired me as a security consultant 18 months ago," he said. "They wanted someone with military credibility, someone towns would trust." Claire watched him closely. "And you trusted them?" "For a while?" Evan's mouth tightened. "They said Sentinel Harbor would help small lake towns, ports, and industrial yards identify risks before trouble reached families. They said Safe Paws would fund care for retired K-9s and support veterans who came home with more silence than sleep." He looked down for a moment. "That was the part that got me." Holt leaned back. "Valor was part of that?" Evan nodded. Valor was 10, gray around the muzzle, hips stiff on cold mornings, brown eyes that made strangers lower their voices without knowing why. He had worked beside me long enough to know my breathing better than most people knew my words. North Star asked if he could appear at a few Safe Paws events. Warm blankets, donation photos, kids petting him. I thought I was helping old dogs get care. His expression changed, not with anger, but with a sorrow that had been standing too long in the rain. I let them put his face on the lie. Priya turned one laptop toward the room. Owen's first USB is heavily protected, but the recovered folder title led us to Cedarline Analytics. Cedarline confirms North Star had access to a limited evaluation license, non-commercial, no derivative product development, no resale, no external deployment. Keene folded his arms. And Sentinel Harbor? Commercial product, Priya said. Sold to municipalities and private security partners. We do not have the full code yet, but Owen's notes suggest similarities in workflow, documentation structure, and some module behavior. Not just broad ideas, specific architecture. Claire added, so the issue is not simply that two systems solve similar problems. Exactly, Priya said. If Owen's notes are accurate, Caleb Strain renamed variables, split folders, altered module labels, and changed comments after Cedarline sent a warning letter. That is not proof by itself, but it is not innocent housekeeping either. A laptop speaker suddenly cracked with a tiny metallic click, one cold, familiar sound in the quiet room. And Atlas rose so fast his claws tapped once against the floor. For 3 seconds, no one spoke, because the dog was staring at the screen as if the sound had opened a door only he could smell. Priya froze the video she had just loaded. That is from an old North Star Gala archive. Owen copied it before access was removed. On screen, a ballroom glowed beneath amber lights. A banner read, Safe Paws Veteran Initiative. Evan stood near a podium in a dark suit, younger by only a year, but lighter somehow, one hand resting near the shoulder of an aging German shepherd. Valor's sable coat had faded at the muzzle and chest, but the dog's posture still carried quiet dignity. He was not looking at the audience. He was looking past the stage toward a side corridor where a narrow man in a gray suit stood half hidden beside a service door. Caleb Strain, Priya said. Caleb was 41, thin, pale and angular, with dark blonde hair combed too neatly and a small trimmed beard that sharpened his already narrow jaw. In photographs, he looked like a man who preferred machines because machines did not ask moral questions. Former employees described him as polite, cold, and brilliant in the way winter ice was brilliant, clean on the surface, dangerous if trusted too quickly. He had joined North Star after a failed cybersecurity startup and had built Sentinel Harbor's technical backbone. Evan leaned closer to his camera. Play that sound again. Priya replayed the clip. The metallic click came from the corridor. Then a softer zipper rasp followed. Evan closed his eyes. North Star's encrypted transport cases, server room cases. Valor knew that sound. I did too. Claire looked from the screen to Atlas. Atlas reacted to it. Because he heard the same rhythm in Evan's coat movement last night, Priya said. Maybe from the same kind of case strap. Maybe from residue on the leather piece Mara gave us. The next file was worse in its quietness. It was not a clean confession or a dramatic recording. It was a short, dim clip from Owen Bell's phone, the image tilted toward a server room hallway. Owen's breathing sounded close to the microphone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Caleb Strain crossed the frame carrying a black rectangular case against his side. Valor stood at the far edge of the hallway, ears forward, watching him. Owen whispered, barely above the hum of the servers. Caleb came in after hours. He took the drive. Valor saw him. That dog never forgot a scent. The clip ended. No one moved right away. Claire felt the weight of what was missing as much as what had been found. The video alone would not carry a case. It did not show what was on the drive. It did not prove copying. It did not explain Owen's later Mountain Road incident. But it turned suspicion into direction, and direction was how buried truths began to breathe. Keene finally spoke. North Star has a gala tomorrow night at Larkhaven Lodge. Priya nodded. Annual Safe Paws event. Public. Donors, veterans, city managers. Sentinel Harbor update presentation. Valor? Claire asked. Priya's fingers moved across the keyboard. A promotional page appeared. There was Valor, older now, wearing a blue Safe Paws bandana, beside the words, "Loyalty deserves care." Scheduled appearance, Priya said softly. Evan's jaw tightened. They still have him. Holt looked at Claire. We do not stop the gala on instinct. We observe, we document. If Caleb is there, if Valor reacts, if North Star moves data, we build from facts. Claire nodded. Atlas and I will attend as federal observers. Evan's eyes found hers through the screen. If Valor sees Caleb again, you will not need words. At that, Atlas stood before Claire gave any command. He faced the glass board, ears lifted, amber eyes fixed on the photograph of Valor. In the bright office overlooking the clean northern harbor, the young K-9 seemed to understand what the people were only beginning to accept. The next night would not be about speeches, donations, or polished promises. It would be about whether one old dog's memory could lead them to the truth hiding behind a good name. Larkhaven Lodge glowed against the northern evening like a warm lantern set beside the water. The building stood on a rise above the lake, all cedar beams, wide windows, and stone chimneys, with strings of golden lights tucked beneath the eaves. Beyond the glass, the dark water moved quietly under a silver winter moon, and the last clean traces of rain still clung to the railings outside. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, wool coats, polished wood, and the faint sweetness of cinnamon from a dessert table near the fireplace. Claire Whitmore arrived as a federal observer, not as a guest, though the woman at registration still tried to hand her a name tag with a blue ribbon that said Community Partner. Claire accepted it with a polite smile and slipped it into her coat pocket. Atlas walked at her left side in his FBI harness, his sable coat brushed smooth, his amber eyes calm but awake. People noticed him first. They always did. Older veterans turned their heads with quiet recognition. A little boy in a red sweater asked his grandmother if Atlas was a hero, and the grandmother, a soft-faced woman with white curls and a pearl pin shaped like a dove, answered, "Most dogs are, sweetheart. Some just wear a uniform." Atlas did not react to the praise. His attention moved through the room the way light moved across water, touching everything, trusting nothing too quickly. The main hall was filled with townspeople, donors, city managers, handlers, and retired working dogs resting beside chairs. One old Labrador slept with his chin on a veteran's boot. A gray-muzzled Belgian Malinois watched the room with sleepy dignity. At the front, banners for Safe Paws Veteran Initiative framed a stage where North Star Civic Systems had arranged a polished display for Sentinel Harbor. The words on the screen were gentle and grand. Technology for safer communities. Care for those who served. Julian Voss stood beneath that screen like a man born for warm lighting. He was 48, tall and elegant, with silver-threaded dark hair, smooth olive skin, and a charcoal suit that looked expensive without raising its voice. His smile was practiced, but not empty. That was what made him dangerous. He had the gift of making people feel seen while revealing almost nothing of himself. Claire had read enough about him to know he had built North Star after selling 2 smaller civic data companies, each one wrapped in language about duty, service, and public trust. Men like Julian did not simply sell products. They sold permission to believe. "Tonight," Julian said from the stage, his voice rich and steady, "we honor loyalty, the loyalty of our veterans, the loyalty of our communities, and yes, the loyalty of the remarkable dogs who have stood beside us in silence, courage, and service." Applause moved through the hall. Claire watched faces soften. That was the power of the right words in the right room. They could make suspicion feel rude. They could make questions feel unkind. Evan Rourke was not inside the lodge. He waited in a surveillance vehicle parked beyond the West Service entrance, accompanied by Daniel Keene. Claire had seen the vehicle when she arrived. Lights off, engine quiet, two silhouettes behind tinted glass. Evan had agreed to stay outside unless Valor was located, and a controlled identification became necessary. It was the only way Claire could keep the evening from turning into emotion before it became evidence. For the first 20 minutes, Atlas remained steady. He watched waiters pass with trays. He ignored the music from the string quartet near the fireplace. He glanced at Julian once, then away. But when Claire moved toward the hallway leading to the lodge's conference rooms, Atlas stopped. His body tightened so subtly that anyone else might have missed it. Claire felt it through the leash. "What do you have?" she murmured. Atlas lowered his nose toward the carpet, then lifted it toward the closed double doors marked staff and presenters only. The smell must have been faint, covered by perfume, coffee, wool, and floor polish. But Atlas found it. Old leather, industrial cleanser, a trace of cold metal from an equipment case, and beneath that a tired canine scent, older and softer than his own. A silver tray slipped somewhere behind Claire, cups chiming against the floor in a bright little crash, and every conversation near the hallway stopped for one startled breath. In that breath, Atlas did not turn toward the noise. He stared at the staff doors as if the sound had only proven what his nose already knew. Claire approached a lodge coordinator stationed near the hallway. The woman was named Paula Hensley, mid-50s, round-faced, with auburn hair pinned too tightly and the anxious courtesy of someone trying to keep an event perfect while everything inside her begged for quiet. Claire showed her credentials and requested access to the K9 holding area listed on the event plan. Paula hesitated only long enough to glance at Atlas, then unlocked the doors with a badge from a lanyard. The hallway beyond was cooler and less decorated. Sound from the gala faded behind them. Atlas led Claire past stacked chairs, audio cables, and a catering cart, then stopped outside a small side room where several retired dogs rested in travel crates and padded spaces. The room smelled of clean blankets and old paws. In the far corner, beneath a blue Safe Paws bandana, lay Valor. He was older than the gala photographs had allowed him to be. 10 years old, maybe more in spirit, with sable fur faded at the muzzle and chest, brown eyes deep as wet earth, and a stiffness in his back legs that made every movement careful. Yet his head lifted the moment Claire entered, not with fear, with recognition of a world that had once required him to notice everything. Claire stepped back into the hall and made the call. "We found him." Daniel brought Evan through the West Service entrance 3 minutes later. Evan wore a dark coat and a knit cap pulled low, his face still pale but steadier than before. The moment he saw Valor, the years between them seemed to fall soundlessly to the floor. Evan did not rush. He knelt several feet away and raised 2 fingers near his chest in that small private signal. Valor stared at him. Then the old German shepherd stood, slowly, painfully, with more dignity than strength. His paws slid once on the floor, but he kept coming until his head reached Evan's chest. Evan folded one arm around him and lowered his face against the dog's neck. No dramatic words came, only a broken breath that carried both apology and homecoming. Atlas stood beside Claire, still as a carved guardian, allowing the old bond its sacred space. Then the hallway badge reader gave a soft beep. Caleb Strain appeared at the doorway, thin and pale in a gray suit, his dark blonde hair combed flat, his trimmed beard making his narrow jaw look sharper. His expression was polite at first, then quickly unreadable. "This area is restricted," he said. Valor changed before anyone spoke. His ears flattened. His body shifted backward until his shoulder pressed against Evan's knee. He did not make a sound, but fear moved through him like a winter wind through dry grass. Atlas stepped forward, placing himself between Valor and Caleb, not lunging, not threatening, simply drawing a line. Claire felt the memory of Owen's video settle over the room. Before Caleb could speak again, the lodge lights flickered once, then twice. Somewhere beyond the wall, the music in the main hall stuttered and resumed. Caleb glanced toward his phone, too quickly. Claire watched his thumb move. Problem with the presentation system? Old building, Caleb said. It happens. It didn't. 6 minutes later, the main Sentinel Harbor demo drive was reported replaced by a clean presentation copy, and the hallway camera covering the service corridor had gone dark during the same window. Claire did not confront Caleb with what she could not yet prove. She requested preservation of badge logs, backup camera feeds, and equipment access records. Caleb smiled with a calm that did not reach his eyes. Atlas solved what politeness could not. He pulled Claire beneath the audio table near the service corridor and pressed his nose against a small strip of worn leather caught around a cable leg. Claire collected it with gloves. Old K9 strap, industrial cleanser, equipment case residue. The same thread, tied tighter now. Evan led Valor away through the side entrance under Daniel's watch. As they passed Caleb, Valor refused to look at him. Atlas did not look away. Claire stood between the warm gala and the cold hallway, the leather strip sealed in evidence, the missing drive already moving somewhere beyond the lodge. She could not arrest Caleb on a dog's fear or a flicker of light. Not yet. But Atlas had found the first loose thread, and somewhere out in the northern dark, the truth had begun to unravel. The morning after the gala came bright and cold, the kind of northern morning that made every roofline shine and every breath look like a small white prayer. Larkhaven Lodge no longer glowed with music and polite applause. By daylight it looked quieter, almost humbled, standing above the lake with its cedar beams damp from the night air. Claire Whitmore arrived before most of the staff, Atlas beside her, his sable coat catching the pale sun as if the storm and the secrets of the night before had polished him for the work ahead. The missing Sentinel Harbor demo drive had changed the case. So had the 6 minutes of dead hallway camera, the badge log alert, and the strip of worn leather Atlas had found under the audio table. A dog's fear had pointed them toward Caleb Strain. Now they needed facts strong enough to stand without a dog's fear beside them. Inside the temporary evidence room, Priya Nandakumar had already built a timeline across 2 monitors. Her black hair was tucked behind one ear, her eyes tired but sharp, and her fingers moved with the quiet speed of someone who trusted data more than speeches. Daniel Keene stood behind her with a paper cup of coffee, his sandy hair slightly rumpled, his narrow face carrying that dry patience Claire had begun to appreciate. He had spent the first hour reviewing badge swipes, equipment checkouts, and the list of vehicles assigned to North Star staff. The camera in the service corridor went dark at 8:46, Priya said. It came back at 8:52. During that window, the presentation system accessed a clean backup drive, not the original demo drive. Vehicle movement? Claire asked. Priya pulled up a grainy parking lot feed from a neighboring marina camera. A white North Star van rolled out from the rear of the lodge at 8:51, headlights low, turning north instead of toward the main road back to Duluth. Internal GPS went offline 2 minutes before departure, Priya said. But a town traffic camera caught it again outside Harbor Larch, then a gas station camera caught it heading toward Pine Quarry Road. Keene tapped the screen. Old North Star storage property out there, closed after a roof collapse according to county records, still owned by a subsidiary. Claire looked down at Atlas. He was seated, but not resting, eyes fixed on the frozen image of the van. Then we follow the road. Before they left, Mara Bell arrived at the field office, carrying a cloth-wrapped notebook against her chest. She looked smaller outside her clock shop, but not weaker. Her silver hair was pinned low, her brown coat buttoned neatly, and the cold had reddened her thin cheeks. "I found this behind Owen's workbench," she said. "I thought it was repair notes. It was not." Claire accepted the notebook with both hands. Inside were dates, file names, and careful entries written in Owen's narrow hand. Cedar line warning received. Folder labels changed, comments removed, module split after review. Near the last page, Owen had written one sentence so plainly it felt like a bell rung in an empty church. If they built it honestly, they would not need to make it look like it belonged to no one. A sudden burst of static cracked from Priya's radio, thin and sharp as ice breaking underfoot, and everyone in the room went still. Then Atlas rose, not toward the sound, but toward Mara's notebook, his nose hovering above the page where Owen had written Caleb's name. The drive north took them past bare birch stands, wet ditches, and pine ridges where sunlight fell in long, clean blades. Evan Rourke rode in the second FBI vehicle, not as a field operator, but as a controlled identifier for North Star's old routes and property. Valor rested beside him under a blanket, the old German shepherd's gray muzzle on Evan's knee. Valor's brown eyes were open, tired but calm, as if being near Evan had returned a missing part of the world to its proper place. Pine Quarry Road narrowed after the last farmhouse. The asphalt gave way to packed dirt, and the trees closed in. Atlas began working before Claire opened the rear door. He leaned toward the air vent, nostrils moving, body tightening with recognition. When Claire let him out, he did not race. He followed the shoulder of the road with careful focus until they found the white van half hidden near an old logging pullout. Its North Star logo had been covered with road grime, but not enough. The van smelled wrong even before the doors opened. Industrial cleanser, wet rubber mats, cold metal, and old K9 leather. Inside, Daniel photographed everything before anyone touched a thing. There were muddy prints on the floor, a scuffed transport case shell, a torn strip of dark fabric, and a retired K9 lead wedged behind the passenger seat. Atlas sniffed the fabric and turned his head sharply toward the north side of the road. Claire bagged it. "Caleb?" Priya checked a field reader against residue from the van's console. His badge accessed the service corridor. His assigned equipment case is missing, and this van was reserved under a maintenance account he controls. Evan stepped forward only after Claire allowed it. He stood beside the open doors, pale but steady, and looked at the worn K9 lead. "This van carried Valor to North Star events," he said. "Same scratched latch, same rubber mat in the back. They kept him moving through places they later pretended he never was." That was the piece Claire needed emotionally, but not legally. Valor was not evidence. Valor was memory with pause and tired eyes. The van, the badge log, the cameras, the fibers, the drive case, and Owen's notebook were the road the law could walk. By late afternoon, Keene had enough for a search warrant on the old North Star storage property near the quarry. The building sat beyond a locked gate, a low warehouse with faded white siding and weeds pushing through gravel. The warrant team entered carefully and found no people inside, only dust, plastic-wrapped office furniture, obsolete monitors, and rows of labeled storage shelves. Atlas led Claire past boxes of Safe Paws brochures to a locked interior room where the air carried the same cleanser and cold metal scent from the gala. Inside, they found the real Sentinel Harbor demo drive in a transport case, a printed cedar line manual with copied section markings, the non-commercial license agreement, internal price sheets for municipalities and private security clients, and draft reports labeled behavioral risk profiles. Priya opened a laptop found in the room using a forensic image process, not the live system. The metadata told its own quiet story. Files had been renamed after Cedar Line's warning. Comments had been removed. Module folders had been split and rebuilt under new labels. Then came the email that tightened the room around them. Julian Voss to Caleb Strain. "Do not let Rourke get Valor back. The dog connects too many places." Caleb tried to leave Harbor Larch before sunset. He was stopped by federal agents near the county road, his expensive calm still arranged across his face like a mask. When he was brought back past the warehouse, he saw Atlas sitting beside Claire. For the first time, Caleb's eyes flickered. Atlas did not growl. He did not need to. He only watched, steady and silent, while the law did what instinct had begun. Claire's phone rang as Caleb was placed into federal custody under proper procedure. Holt's voice came through, low and firm. Julian Voss is now in the warrant pipeline. North Star's contracts are being frozen pending review. Outside the warehouse, Evan stood with Valor leaning against his leg. The old dog's eyes were half closed in the cold light. Evan rested a hand on his head and whispered, "You brought us back, old friend." Atlas walked to Claire's evidence bag and touched his nose gently to the sealed strip of leather, as if marking the end of one trail and the beginning of the next. By the time Harbor Larch gathered inside the community hall, the worst part of the case had already moved from rumor into record. Caleb Strain had been taken into federal custody after the warehouse search. Julian Voss had been served through proper channels and surrendered through his attorney before sunrise. North Star Civic Systems had not vanished, and the town had not collapsed, but the beautiful mask had slipped far enough for ordinary people to see the colder face beneath it. The contracts tied to Sentinel Harbor were frozen pending review. Cedar Line Analytics had stepped forward as the software company whose limited license had been stretched, twisted, and carried far beyond what had been promised. The SafePaws data had been sealed for an independent audit. It was not a clean ending. Real endings rarely were. But it was a beginning that no longer belonged to North Star. The Harbor Larch Community Hall was an old white building near the lake, with tall windows, maple floors, and a stage that had hosted school plays, winter concerts, pancake breakfasts, and more town arguments than anyone cared to count. That morning, sunlight poured through the glass in pale gold sheets. The lake beyond the road glittered under a cold blue sky, and people came in carrying paper cups of coffee, wool scarves, careful questions, and the quiet embarrassment of those who had trusted a polished voice too easily. Claire Whitmore stood near the front with Atlas beside her. Atlas wore his FBI harness, but his posture was softer than it had been at the warehouse. He watched the room without suspicion, only attention. Near the first row sat Mara Bell, tall and thin in her brown coat, her silver hair pinned low and her hands resting over Owen's wooden box. Grief had not left her. It had merely learned to sit upright. Behind her stood Evan Rourke, with Valor at his side. Evan's face was still drawn from the strain of the past days, but the lost, hunted look had begun to ease. Valor leaned lightly against his leg, a gray-muzzled German shepherd with brown eyes deep enough to hold years of service, confusion, and now, at last, a little peace. A representative from Cedar Line Analytics had arrived as well. Her name was Teresa Vale, a woman in her mid-40s with warm brown skin, shoulder-length black curls, and rectangular glasses that made her thoughtful eyes seem even steadier. She was not dramatic, not angry in the loud way people expected. She spoke with the calm precision of someone who had spent years protecting work that lived mostly in code, manuals, and promises. Beside her sat Nora Whitcomb, director of the North Shore Retired K9 Trust, a sturdy woman in her late 50s with wind-reddened cheeks, short gray hair, and the practical kindness of someone who had washed muddy paws, balanced small budgets, and sat beside old dogs through difficult nights. Claire did not reveal sealed evidence. She did not turn the meeting into a show. She explained only what could be said. North Star had gained access under the language of community service and research. Cedar Line's limited license had been used outside its allowed purpose. Sentinel Harbor had been developed and sold commercially, while key questions remained about copied structure, altered files, and concealed changes. Reports built from veteran and K9 program data had traveled farther than donors and participants had been led to believe. Her voice remained even, but beneath the evenness was something the room understood. Some betrayals were worse because they wore the face of kindness. A man in the second row rose slowly. He was Harold Mercer, a retired dock worker in his 70s with thick white eyebrows, a plaid coat, and large hands that looked made for rope, weather, and honest work. "Agent Whitmore," he said, his voice rough but respectful. "Is that old dog part of the evidence?" The room turned toward Valor. Evan's hand settled gently on Valor's head, but he did not answer for Claire. He waited. Claire looked at Harold, then at the room. "No, Valor is not evidence. He is not a file, not a record, and not a tool for any company or agency. The evidence is in the logs, emails, drives, license records, metadata, and contracts. Valor helped us find direction. There is a difference." A chair leg scraped suddenly across the wooden floor, loud in the hush, and Valor flinched just once. Before anyone could speak, Atlas rose and stepped quietly between Valor and the aisle, not with threat, not with force, but with the solemn grace of a young guardian telling the whole room, "This old soul has carried enough." No one laughed. No one scolded the movement. Even Harold lowered his eyes, as if he had received the answer more clearly from Atlas than from any official sentence. Evan took one careful breath. "Valor is not a witness," he said. "He is my partner. He walked through too many cold mornings beside me. Then he was used in photographs, banners, and speeches by people who forgot he had a heart. He did not solve this case, but he never stopped remembering where the trail began." Mara stood then. The wooden box remained in her hands. "My son Owen believed good work should protect people," she said. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. "He was not perfect. He forgot birthdays. He left coffee cups and clocks. He once tried to fix my toaster and made it play radio static for a week." A small ripple of gentle laughter moved through the hall, soft as light on water. Mara smiled through tired eyes. But he knew when something was wrong, and he left enough behind for better people to finish what he could not. Nora Whitcomb announced that the North Shore Retired K-9 Trust would take temporary oversight of the Safe Paws animals and records with outside review and public reporting. Teresa Vale confirmed Cedar Line would cooperate with federal authorities and help separate legitimate community tools from unauthorized use. None of it sounded magical. It sounded like paperwork, audits, board meetings, and hard winter work. But Claire knew that was how true repair often arrived, not as thunder, but as steady hands. Before the meeting ended, Mara walked to Evan and opened the wooden box. From inside, she took Valor's old collar tag and placed it in his palm. "Owen said this belonged with him," she said. Evan closed his fingers around it. For a moment, he looked like a man trying to hold both gratitude and grief without dropping either. "Thank you," he whispered. Later, at Claire's cabin by Lake Superior, morning had softened into a clear, bright calm. Evan came to say goodbye, with Valor moving slowly at his side. Atlas ran onto the porch, then stopped before the old shepherd. The two dogs touched noses, the young one steady, the old one weary, but trusting. Claire stood in the doorway, her chestnut hair loose around her shoulders, watching sunlight spread across the lake like a blessing no one had asked for, but everyone needed. "I do not know where to start," Evan said. Claire looked at Valor resting near his boot, then at Atlas, lying on the porch step with his eyes turned toward the pines. "Sometimes starting over does not need a map," she said. "Sometimes it only needs someone loyal enough to stand beside you." Evan nodded, unable to answer for a while. Valor lowered himself into the thin sunlight at his feet. Atlas settled nearby, not guarding now, simply keeping company. The forest breathed, the lake shone, and Claire understood that justice did not always arrive with a raised voice. Sometimes it came through a knock in the rain, a mother's wooden box, a man who had nearly lost hope, and a dog who knew who needed saving before the people around him were ready to see it. In the end, this story was never only about software, contracts, or a hidden drive. It was about trust, and what happens when trust is used for selfish gain. North Star tried to hide behind kind words, polished speeches, and the image of loyal dogs. But truth has a way of finding the one small crack in every wall. Sometimes that truth is carried in a wooden box. Sometimes it is protected by a grieving mother. Sometimes it walks on four paws, with quiet eyes and a heart that remembers what people try to forget. Claire, Evan, Atlas, and Valor remind us that goodness is not always loud. It does not always stand on a stage or wear a perfect smile. Often, goodness is found in simple choices, opening a door to someone in need, protecting the vulnerable, telling the truth when silence would be easier, and caring for an old animal who has already given the best years of his life. There is a lesson here for all of us. In daily life, we may not face a case as large as North Star. We may not uncover hidden files or follow a trail through the pine roads of northern Minnesota. But every day, we are given smaller choices. We can be honest when no one is watching. We can be gentle with those who are tired. We can show patience to the elderly, kindness to our neighbors, and love to the animals who trust us without question. Animals do not ask for wealth, titles, or perfect lives. They ask for food, shelter, kindness, and a safe place beside us. A loyal dog may not understand our words, but he understands our heart. He knows when we are lonely. He knows when we are afraid. He knows when we need someone to stand beside us, even in silence. Perhaps that is one of God's quiet miracles. He placed these faithful creatures in our lives to remind us of the kind of love that does not bargain, does not boast, and does not walk away. If this story touched your heart, let it be more than just a story. Let it remind you to call someone you love, forgive someone if you can, help someone who is carrying a burden, and treat every animal with compassion. A small act of kindness may look ordinary today, but in God's hands, even the smallest act can become the beginning of someone's rescue. May God bless every person watching this. May He protect your home, guide your steps, comfort your heart, and surround you with loyal love in difficult seasons. May He bless the animals who walk beside us, the veterans who have served, the families who are healing, and every quiet soul still waiting for a second chance. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who still believes in loyalty, kindness, and hope. Leave a comment below and tell us which moment touched you the most. And if you enjoy stories about faithful animals, second chances, and the goodness still alive in this world, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that remind people to live with courage, love deeply, and never overlook the quiet miracles God places right in front of us.